clearly struggling with a job they're, well, just not cut out for.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Or even thinking back to school maybe, when the standard way of learning just didn't quite uh, click for you.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
such a frustrating feeling, isn't it?
It really is. And the hidden costs of that kind of mismatch, personal costs, economic costs,
Mhm.
are actually much bigger than most of us realize.
So today we're doing a deep dive into this really fascinating early 20th century book that tackled this problem head on. It's called Measure Your Mind, the Mentimeter and How to Use It.
Right, and it's by Dr. M.R. Trabue. He was a real pioneer in measuring intelligence for the U.S. Army and Columbia University, and also Frank Parker Stockbridge, who was a well-known author and journalist.
And our mission here is to explore how these authors, and really the whole field of psychology back then, set out on this ambitious journey to objectively measure human abilities.
Yeah, and you'll see how their work, it wasn't just academic theory. It actually went on to, well, transform industries, change military strategy, and even challenge how we structure education itself.
All driven by this one big goal: to get past the guesswork, to really understand and then use human potential more effectively. So let's start by looking at just how big this problem of misplacement really was.
Well, the authors point out this huge, almost hidden economic drain on businesses. They called it labor turnover. Employers, you see, they understood fine-tuning machinery, the costs there.
Sure, makes sense.
But they often completely missed the enormous expense of constantly training or breaking in new employees who just weren't the right fit for the job after all.
And we're not just talking about the salary they paid someone who didn't work out, are we?
No, not at all. It was much more than that. Think about spoiled materials, lower productivity from that individual.
Right. Maybe even slowing down the whole team or process.
Exactly. Slowing down entire operations because one person couldn't keep up. The book has this great analogy. Companies spending millions on materials, but basically waiving inspection on the people they hired.
Ouch. Complaining only after the damage was done.
Precisely. And this went way beyond just the workplace. They saw that individuals often just didn't know their own strengths or limitations. Wanting a certain job isn't always enough.
Right. Desire doesn't always equal ability.
Exactly. You might have these sort of hidden inhibitions holding you back that nobody notices until failure happens again and again. And this mismatch, this poor fit between person and job, they saw it as a root cause of so much industrial unrest, unhappiness, inefficiency, just general discontent.
And what made it worse was how people thought they could judge others,
Yep.
right? This belief that you could just look at someone.
Yeah, that was a huge part of the problem, relying on subjective judgment. The authors mentioned Professor Terman from Stanford, who really debunked things like phrenology, reading bumps on the skull.
Okay, that sounds like pseudoscience.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't just the obvious quackery. Even everyday judgments, like by experienced managers or observers, they were still incredibly flawed, full of personal bias.
They had an experiment showing that, didn't they?
They did. Terman had university classmates, people who'd worked closely together for a whole year, rate each other's intelligence. The results were, well, all over the place.
How so?
Almost everyone was rated near the top by someone and near the bottom by someone else. It just showed how much things like appearance, how well someone spoke, or just whether you liked them or not, influenced the ratings.
Wow. So basically, subjective judgment was unreliable.
Completely. The authors were very clear. Any subjective method claiming perfection was basically fraudulent. No way around it.
Okay, so if intuition and just looking at people was failing so badly, what was the alternative? How did they propose measuring something as complex as the mind?
Well, their core idea was actually pretty clever, drawing an analogy from machines. We use precise tools, gauges to measure what a machine can do, horsepower, efficiency, whatever.
Right.
So why shouldn't we have similar scientific tools for measuring human capacities? They admitted the mind is way more complex than a car, obviously.
Of course.
But they argued that for practical purposes, you could measure its essential qualities.
And that led them to make some important distinctions, didn't it? They didn't just talk about intelligence as one thing.
Exactly. That was key. They broke it down. They talked about mental capacity, that sort of your inherited potential, the raw hardware, like the size of the tank, as they put it.
Okay, your innate potential.
And there's mental ability. That's your capacity plus your experience in education, what you can actually do or say. And that, they argued, is what the tests could definitely measure.
And the third part.
That was acquired knowledge. Just the facts and information you've learned. Traditional exams like school tests or civil service exams usually measure this. But the authors thought this could be misleading. if you're trying to gauge real underlying ability.
Ah, I see. So knowing lots of facts doesn't automatically mean you have high ability or capacity.
Precisely. This was a big shift. These new scientific tests aim to be objective, free from personal bias. They should give roughly the same result no matter who gave the test or when.
Which is a world away from those inconsistent classmate ratings you mentioned.
Absolutely. Now, they acknowledged it's hard, maybe impossible, to perfectly separate inherited capacity from learned knowledge. But the goal was to find out what someone could actually do, not just what they could remember. And these methods were based on facts, on data, not guesswork or magic. They'd been tested in the real world.
So the theory sounds solid, but where did they really prove these ideas on a massive scale? You mentioned the military earlier. World War I seems like it would be the ultimate test.
It really was the crucible. You got nearly 3 million American soldiers needing placement, quickly, effectively, where they'd be most useful. The old hit-or-miss methods just wouldn't cut it anymore.
The square peg in a round hole problem, but on a national emergency scale.
Exactly. They couldn't afford that kind of inefficiency.
So how did the psychologists step up? It must have been a huge undertaking.
It was. Dr. Yerkes led a committee. Basically, the entire American Psychological Association got involved. They actually faced some initial pushback, some skepticism from the Army leadership.
I can imagine.
But they convinced them, and by mid-1917, the Division of Psychology was up and running. It was this incredible collaboration between science and the military.
And what kinds of tests did they develop for all these soldiers? Millions of them.
They came up with 3 main types. First, the alpha tests. These were for recruits who could read and write English. Standardized group tests.
Okay. What about those who couldn't?
That's where the beta test came in. A really brilliant innovation. These were for soldiers who were illiterate or didn't speak English. They used pictures, visual cues, gestures, no language needed.
Wow, so they could still measure intelligence without relying on language skills?
Yes, and find potentially very intelligent individuals who might otherwise have been overlooked. It was remarkable.
And was there a safety net for people who didn't do well on either?
There was. The third type was individual tests. If someone failed alpha or beta, they'd get a one-on-one examination with a psychologist lasting maybe half an hour to an hour and a half. This makes sure no one was unfairly discharged or just assigned to labor duty without a proper look.
That sounds thorough. And this led to some kind of grading system.
The famous AE grading system, A, B, C+, C, C, D, D, E. It gave the Army a quick, objective way to classify huge numbers of men.
And did it actually work? Did it make a difference on the ground?
The impact was huge, apparently.
Yeah.
They found potential officers mainly in the A and B groups. People with lower scores, the D and E groups, could be quickly identified for roles that fit their abilities or sometimes screened out entirely.
So it streamlined the whole process.
Massively. It sped up the sorting process incredibly, saved time, saved money. As the authors noted, speed counts in a war that costs $50 million per day. It really validated the practical power of these psychological tools.
So the battlefield was one major proving ground, but you said these ideas also started changing things in civilian life, education, and industry.
Absolutely. Let's look at schools first. The authors pointed out a really worrying statistic back then. Something like 1/3 to 1/2 of kids in U.S. public schools weren't progressing grade by grade as expected.
1/3 to 1/2, that's enormous.
It is. And maybe 10–15% were 2 years or more behind. It just screamed out that the system wasn't understanding or catering to individual differences very well.
So what did they propose? How did they use these testing ideas in schools?
Well, they shared this really interesting case study from a school in New York City, PS 64. They already had special classes for kids considered defective in the language of the time.
Okay.
So the psychologists thought, why not create special classes for the kids at the other end, children with very superior intelligence?
Ah, gifted programs, essentially. How did they pick the kids?
It was quite thorough. They looked at age, school records, how they did in class recitations, if they'd won drawing prizes, even little interesting incidents that showed sharp thinking.
Like that story about the boy defining God versus guard.
Exactly, that little ER anecdote. But what's also really interesting is that intelligence alone wasn't enough.
Oh.
They specifically mentioned 2 kids who had the intellectual qualifications but weren't chosen because of, quote, unfavorable character traits. It shows they were looking at the whole child, not just test scores.
That's quite insightful. And what were these classes like?
Really enriched. It wasn't just more advanced standard subjects. They had music, drawing, writing plays, library visits, cooking clubs, violin lessons, excursions to museums, historical sites. Sounds amazing, actually.
Definitely sounds ahead of its time. Did these tests also prove useful for, say, getting into college?
Yes, they did. They cite the Carnegie Institute of Technology, now Carnegie Mellon, which used intelligence tests for admissions. And they found it significantly cut down the number of students who later dropped out because of poor grades. So it seemed to work for college admissions, too.
And all this led the authors to make a pretty bold statement about education overall, didn't it?
It did. A really provocative conclusion. They argued that traditional education was mainly set up for abstract thinkers, people good with ideas and symbols.
Okay.
But then maybe left behind roughly half the population, people who might not shine with abstract concepts, but could be brilliant with concrete things, with objects, or with people.
Practical intelligence, maybe?
Yeah.
Or
But
social intelligence?
sort of.
Yeah.
And they argued that society owed an appropriate education to all these different types of minds, not just the abstract thinkers. Otherwise, you breed discontent and miss out on potential. That's a powerful idea even now.
It really is. Okay, so education was one area. What about industry? We touched on the waved inspection idea earlier.
Right. Dr. Link's analogy. Companies meticulous about materials, but careless about people. Mental tests were presented as the way to finally inspect the personnel properly.
Can you give an example of where this really paid off?
Yeah, there's a great one from a munitions plant. Big experiment, over 300 girls inspecting artillery shells. They designed specific tests for the skills needed.
Like what?
Things like card sorting for dexterity, a tapping test for speed, even an accuracy test using a wired plate and a metronome. You had to tap specific points in time.
Clever. And did the tests predict who would be good at the job?
Remarkably well, according to the book. The tests accurately predicted performance, leading to, and I quote, very definite time and money savings and increase in plant efficiency.
Yeah.
Real, tangible results.
And wasn't there that anecdote about the clerk who didn't love the part?
Oh, yeah, that's a classic. This young woman, apparently unprepossessing in appearance, the office manager had serious doubts, but she aced the psychological tests, so they gave her a shot. And she was amazing, mastered 4 different jobs in just 6 weeks. It was a perfect example of the tests revealing potential that simple observation completely missed.
So the test could override subjective bias.
Exactly. By 1919, the book claims lots of big companies were using these tests for hiring, placing people, promotions, and apparently they all agreed the tests were valuable, both economically and socially. It really changed how businesses thought about hiring.
So let's peek inside this Mentimeter toolkit. You said it wasn't just one test.
No, that's the interesting thing. It was more like a flexible system, a framework. Users could pick and choose or even create a team of tests depending on what specific qualities they needed to measure for a job or purpose.
That sounds quite modern, actually. What were some examples of these tests? They sound quite inventive.
Some were really creative. For instance, how do you test a baby? They had typical performance tests. For a 3-month-old, does it turn its eyes towards a sound? At 6 months, can it balance its head, reach for a toy? Basic developmental milestones used as indicators.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the beta tests for non-English speakers?
They used things like pictorial absurdities. Pictures with something obviously wrong or missing. You had to spot the error. It tested observation and reasoning, completely visually.
Clever. And for jobs needing precision, like office work.
They had tests like checking identity of numbers. You'd compare long strings of digits side by side to find discrepancies. Tests pure attention to detail.
Sounds tedious.
Probably was. Then there was the speaking vocabulary test. This was done one-on-one. An examiner would ask you to define words, starting easy, like coat, and getting progressively harder, rheostat, behemoth, paleography.
Wow, quite a range.
And because it was individual, the examiner could also observe other things, like confidence, how you approach the task, those intangible attitudes they mentioned.
Any other unusual ones?
Oh, the poetic discrimination test was unique. They'd give you 3 versions of a poem stanza, one good, one mediocre, one poor, and you had to rank them.
Seriously? How did they decide which was which?
They validated it by getting judgments from hundreds of literary experts first. It showed how rigorously they tried to standardize even subjective things like aesthetic taste. And then, of course, straightforward, logical conclusions, pure reasoning puzzles based on given statements.
So quite a diverse toolkit. How did they know if a particular test or team of tests was actually any good for predicting job success or whatever they were measuring?
They use statistics, specifically something called a coefficient of coordination, which sounds a lot like what we call a coefficient of correlation
Right,
today.
a statistical measure.
Right. It basically quantified how strongly the test scores matched up with real-world outcomes, like job performance ratings from supervisors or success in training. This number told them how much faith they could put in a test for a specific purpose.
So it wasn't just about inventing tests, but scientifically proving they worked.
Exactly. They stressed that no test was perfect, none infallible. But these scientifically chosen, validated tests were far, far more objective and reliable than just relying on gut feelings or interviews alone.
This whole deep dive into their work, it really brings home how important it is to try and understand individual potential, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And to find ways to match people with the right opportunities.
It absolutely does. These early psychologists, Trabue and Stockbridge included, they really laid the foundation for thinking about people more objectively, aiming for a world that was hopefully more efficient, but also maybe more just, by not forcing people into roles where they couldn't succeed.
It really challenged the status quo.
Definitely. And it leaves you thinking, doesn't it? Even today, with all our advancements, if we really committed to understanding the full range of human minds, designing education, designing careers to truly fit people's inherent strengths, instead of just using these sort of one-size-fits-all molds, how much more happiness could people find? And how much more harmonious, maybe more productive, could our society be? It's a powerful question they were already asking a century ago.